Jill, how much, I'm not going to ask you to put a percentage on it, but how much would you say the problems that we've been facing through the various maxi, mini, in-between budgets have tried to solve are to do specifically with Brexit? How much might be long-term, long-running problems of productivity, the hangover of 2008 and so on?
So there's undoubtedly been a long-run problem. You can go back to 2008. That's when the UK's sort of productivity problem started, what people throughout the decade before the Brexit referendum were referring to as the productivity puzzle. Why had UK productivity suddenly gone down? So you can't attribute that to Brexit. But I think you can say that economists before the referendum were nearly universally predicting that if you put up trade barriers to trading with your biggest trade partner, at least in the short run, you are going to take some sort of economic hit. You make yourself less attractive for business investment, and Rishi Sunak, when he was Chancellor, told the Treasury Select Committee back in March that business investment had been very low 2016 to 2020 because it wasn't clear what the UK's relationship would be with the EU. So that has taken a hit. Sterling has taken a hit. That puts up prices. We saw that very quickly after the referendum. And we've seen some inflation in food prices. I think people estimated that Brexit might have added about 6% to food prices. That isn't something that the economies that didn't Brexit, so the rest of the EU are suffering from. But if you look at cost of living now, inflation in Germany is pretty high. Inflation, in the US is quite high. So that is not a uniquely British problem. So I think it's right to attribute that to a variety of other things. But to add to Ken's list of Brexit, whether it's a problem or not is a different issue. But undoubtedly there are sectors that had come to depend on recruitment of cheap labour, largely from the EU, which are struggling to adjust to the absence of that labour because,
OK, well, we start with a disappointing level of agreement that actually there is a series of different issues here. I want to talk really about the extent to which Brexit can be a principal cause or not. And I'm going to come back to your point, by the way, Richard, about migration a little later, if we may. Ken, low productivity has dogged the UK. I mean, Jill said from 2008, but actually I think it was an issue even in your time as
well, not to the same extent. No, we had decent growth. We thought our normal level of growth was 2.5%. We had low, and we exceeded it. We're over 3% sometimes. But then I used to raise interest rates because I didn't have an independent bank. I argued with Eddie George, but I used to and so we get 2.5% plus we were achieving by way of growth. We got inflation down to the 2% target that we'd set ourselves, and we made sure we kept it there. We adjusted fiscal policy accordingly. That's what's guarded my policy. I did not go in for any mad dash for growth by just cutting taxes. We're talking about history at the moment.
If you're referring to any...
well, I was trying to avoid contemporary events, yes. I think that theory should have been banged on the head for all time recently. Taxes and public spending were set in order to keep the public finances sound and together with monetary policy, keep inflation as near to our target of 2% as we could.
Richard.
But that's how we were going then. And it boomed even more in the early 2000s because we kept having economic booms, which the top wasn't taken off quite as it should have been, as it used to be. And by 2008, we crashed and we've never really recovered.
But Ken's actually reinforced and agreed with the very point I've just made, which was that, wonderfully, growth was averaging, in Ken's tenure, 2.5% a year, give or take. Well, we're now lucky to get to 1.5%, and the reason is because you didn't have to, because you've done such a great job in getting tax take down to less than 30%. And I repeat what I said, it's now 30% and heading north, and that is a massive constraint on productivity, on growth, on the desire of people and businesses to invest in the UK. And so it's quite right to go for low taxes, but you've got to cut unnecessary regulation, and of course got to do it in a funded way, which is what the previous regime failed to do.
What I was able to do was get Britain to take the benefits out of our creation, because we led creating the single market, out of the single market. we suddenly had these great opportunities open to us because we were in the biggest, border-free practically, free trade rate in the world. And of course we were working on moving towards a single currency to take away another obstacle.
But heavens, we didn't go there.
Variable. Well, we couldn't get the fiscal rules and the others right, and I wouldn't have joined unless we could have got fiscal rules working.
In the glorious Clarke as Chancellor era, of which we've all been speaking, you did have...
We had our moments.
You had all of the weapons at your disposal. You were controlled both of fiscal policy, tax and all of that, and monetary policy. And in a sense, actually, Richard's point is that joining the EU, as the Greeks, for example, discovered, took those powers away from you.
Well, because you did have to follow fiscal... I mean, if you'd never gone to a... I never reached a stage where I thought we could join as a state of preparation, but I took a large part... Jill used to come to my press secretary. We spent a large part in discussions about trying to get the rules to single currency, which took years. And one of the things that was clear was you did need some common understanding, not total binding things, amongst all the member states on sensible fiscal policy, and the monetary policy needed to be in the hands of an independent bank, the European Central Bank. The Greeks should never... I mean, if you want me to criticise EU policy after we'd left, the Greeks should never have been let into the single currency when they were let in. It was for political reasons, and you quite rightly say they were shocked to discover that they were going to be in serious trouble if they didn't just stop trying to borrow their way out of trouble all the time.
Jill?
Well, I think on the single currency, I'm not sure the UK would ever have gone into the single currency. That was one of the sort of debates we had back when Ken Clarke was Chancellor about keeping the option open. On the independent central bank, clearly the moment Gordon Brown as Chancellor stood up and announced that he was making the central bank independence, extending what we then termed the Ken and Eddie show to actually giving full independence rather than just transparency.
The then Governor of Bank of England.
Eddie George.
Eddie George, yeah.
Yeah, when we moved on to full independence, there was immediately a sort of discount on UK interest rates because they perceived that the UK was less risky than it had been then. But I think the really interesting question now, and I think this comes to what Richard was saying, and maybe going back to the sort of, is, Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng did try to go straight for cutting taxes, but they didn't have the other pillars of their new policy in place, and so it was extremely unconvincing that it would work. They didn't set out their plans for radical deregulation, nor give any indication that they could actually get that through Parliament, nor did they set out plans to rein back the state and cut spending, which is now dominated by health spending. They didn't show that they had feasible plans they could get through Parliament to do that. Now, if they'd wanted to succeed, the logical way of doing it would have been to spend political capital on showing you actually can deregulate and change the plan.
I don't want to go over that again, because we've discussed that painful episode on this programme and others on Sky. I'd like to talk a bit more about Richard's point. Of course, one of the other elements in this whole equation, and you're all... This is worrying. You're all sort of agreeing that, in fact, Brexit had a big part, but it's not. It's part of a
I'm not agreeing at a big part. I'm not agreeing that.
Okay, well, a significant, a meaningful part, but it's part of a wider set of things. The point that you're making, Richard, which is about migration, which you think is an important issue. The CBI has been saying the last couple of days, and we heard... the leader of the opposition talking about it today, that CBI has been saying employers are crying out for people to do jobs. More than 1 million EU citizens went home after Brexit. Did Brexit not shoot us in the foot and actually provide the single biggest obstacle to growth now?
It's exactly the opposite. Why did we have the lowest growth decade since the Second World War in the last decade? The answer is because we've had no real wage growth, because we had unlimited freedom of movement. And that was an absolutely massive factor. What's happening now is you've got the big multinationals saying we want more cheap, low-skilled immigration. when Ken was Chancellor, the reason you had real wage growth was because you couldn't just turn the tap on for cheap labour. So if businesses couldn't afford the labour, they invested in capital equipment. That's how economics has always historically worked. If you can't afford the labour, you invest in capital equipment. We've got a shocking investment track record in the last 20 years because of the available of cheap, low-skilled labour. Actually, Sir Keir Starmer's touched on it today. We're now all finally talking about the importance of growth. The way you get growth is you improve productivity. We haven't got a people shortage in this country. We've tragically got 5.3 million people.
Well, there's no big employer would agree with you.
Trevor, there are 5.3 million people on out-of-work benefits. And there's a reason why someone like a big retailer complaining last week they couldn't get anybody to work in their warehouses, because they're offering 20% less than one of their neighbouring competitors. So they just want to reach for the cheap labour tiller. What about actually offering a proper national living wage and meeting your competitors?
Ken Clarke, this is a really interesting picture of your era, because not only do you control fiscal policy, you also control monetary policy, but according to Richard, you're also able to close the tap on migration. I didn't know that you were so immensely powerful, but is that an issue now, do you think?
It is now. I can't remember when freedom of movement came in. I think it may have come in my day.
Post-accession, 2004-5 was really that was the watershed. I think we agree.
Well, I think what changed it, I'm going to disappoint you again. I do agree with some of what Richard said. What happened when the EU enlarged to take in Eastern European countries rather more quickly than I would have argued. I argued against letting Croatia. I was wrong about Croatia. I was much more. Our Foreign Office wanted to let them all in, and I was wanting to slow down as Chancellor. Anyway, what happened was suddenly a flood of cheap labour became available to us. But more importantly, freedom of movement on balance is a good thing. It's essential in a free market. If you've got a totally free market as we created. But because you get skilled people going backwards and forwards freely, and people can enjoy careers partly in their own country, partly when they're younger going abroad, and lots of good people came here, people who've been there. Our employers over the years have rather slipped into not wanting to train the skilled people that they're short of.
Exactly.
And they're used to getting them to come straight from Romania. I mean, our health service is the one that most members of the public were most familiar with. The number of immigrant workers at every level of skill in the health service is a terribly high proportion of the entire workforce. That's why what we should be doing now, for our own domestic reasons, as we are never going to go back into freedom of movement. You don't have to worry about that. I can't see that ever happening. Then is actually going for really seriously for skills training and retraining throughout people's lives. Stop neglecting further education, which got no money at all from the present government when they were giving more money to schools recently. Stop running down further education and provide incentives like the apprentice levy, but other incentives and disincentives to make employers train their own skills, which they always used to.
You could be reading from the speech made today by the leader of the opposition.
He hasn't converted me to support the Labour Party, but I agreed entirely with what Keir Starmer said on the subject.
But seriously, Trevor, we've got 1.5 million more people on out-of-work benefits than pre-COVID, and that is a tragedy of wasted talent. And we have to, as a nation, support, help and train and get these people back into work. And then we haven't got a labour shortage.
Jill, let's talk about what we might do. And let's start with this issue of the labour shortage. In order to, at the moment, we don't seem to have reduced the number of migrants coming to the country. The net migration is still running at something like 250,000, but now they're coming from somewhere different. They're coming from India and they're coming from China. In a sense, Brexit produced exactly the reverse of what I think a lot of people thought it should do. And Richard's point is that that's because it's not really being implemented. Do you think that we actually have a choice here?
About
what we do on the migration front?
So it is quite interesting that we've, in a sense, delivered on migration. I mean, people ask about delivering sort of Brexit. We have moved to give visas to people who have higher skills. That's what the new migration regime does through the sort of points-based scheme. We now have people coming into IT, so IT professionals, people using the health visa because we don't have enough of our own workforce there. The real sort of dialogue of the deaf, in a sense, between business and government at the moment is about people at the lower end, so either low-skilled or low-paid people, where business, obviously, that has been used to having access to low-paid people, doesn't particularly want to change its business model. For some, it may mean investing. For others, it'll just mean going out of business because, you know, it's not clear you can automate restaurants or coffee bars in a sort of hugely, you know, valuable way. And there's quite a lot of the people who depended. Retail and hospitality is one of the sectors that's very badly hit. Farming negotiates every year with DEFRA, and the Home Office does a bit of a dance about what's called the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Scheme. Are they allowed to, you know, offer visas? It was clear, actually, that Eastern Europeans were stopping coming even before Brexit, because actually the, you know, growth of the Eastern European economies, the closing of that gap, meant, I think, the Migration Advisory Committee said...
Poland got richer, people were going back.
So actually, you know, we weren't going to get that access anymore anyway.
Richard,
so.
this is a bit of a problem for your position, isn't it? Because you say that actually we should train people up, but actually the gaps where we have a shortage are in places, for example, hospitality, short 174,000, social care, low-paid, minimum wage jobs, probably a bit more than that, actually. Agriculture, of course, is seasonal. But the issue of labour shortages in many of these sectors is not really one about training our people. It is simply haven't got enough bodies.
It's not. You've absolutely hit it on the head. You've said social care is low paid. That's a disgrace. It's a vital, vital industry. We shouldn't be just naturally assuming that they should be lowly paid. I go back to the age-old way that economies work. If you can't find the labour, you pay more. And either the labour arrives or you invest in capital equipment. Right? So, for example, why haven't we invested in the combine harvester for apple picking or for strawberry picking or for grape picking? Why? Because you could have cheap, overseas, low-skilled labour, so people didn't invest. This changes it. Businesses have to invest or they will suffer. That's what competition is all about.
You were a champion of wage restraint as Chancellor. And what would you say about what Richard just said? It sounds to me like he'd be on the opposite side to you.
Well, because I can remember you keep making me go back into my past, which I usually
It's such an interesting past.
Well, the 70s and 80s, when we had wages and prices chasing each other, which is what the Bank of England's got to avoid us returning to. That's a very important priority at the moment. We had more powerful trade unionism. We had very militant trade unionism in those days. And we're going to have a winter of discontent this winter, but we don't want to go back to that, and the Bank of England's got to do its stuff. Going back to what you say, wage increases have got to be based on productivity improvements. That actually is what increases everybody's success in a successful economy. And it's not the idea that all you do is just put wages up and everything sorts itself out is a recipe for returning to the 1970s and hyperinflation. The social care, trying to remember the name of this programme, social care, I actually do, again, agree with quite a bit. That's an area that's going to need more public spending and investment to make sure that the pay and the training and the career prospects of the people who work in it are actually elevated to the status they deserve. It's one of the reasons why we're never going to be back to low taxation again of the kind I was used to. We're not going to have the small state. Okay. That's a right-wing illusion because we're all growing older and we're getting more demanding. And the National Health Service and social care, are, amongst other things, are going to require a much higher level of public spending than I would have accepted in the 1990s.
Let me just put one last point, because we've got about a minute or so. Richard, one thing that we haven't discussed is the trading relationship. There are many people, I know Kenneth's one, and I suspect Jill's also of this view, that say that the situation that we now have is one that it's inhibiting growth because we have an inhibited trading relationship with the EU. Let's forget about the promise of global Britain and all that for a moment. But do you accept that there is a problem. OBR says maybe 4% of GDP.
I don't accept what the OBR says because it's got a woeful track record on almost everything it's forecast in the last 2 or 3 years. No, I don't accept that. But look, there's no question that, in a sense, the EU's tried to punish us for having the temerity to leave. But let's remember, trade with Europe is it's a minority, really quite a small part of our overall economy. And what Ken's rightly said is you've got to focus on investment and productivity and growth, but you only get that by having lower taxes, sensible regulations. When Ken was in charge, we didn't have the burden of another 20 years of daft EU regulations. But what this government's failed to do is to start to reduce those. And that has a real impact. The impact of hindering regulations is a massive impediment to growth for businesses.
Well, the policy of the present government, forced upon it by its rather fanatic right-wing element that it's now got, rather too many of on the backbenchers, is to seek free trade agreements with the entire globe, including pursuing free trade agreements with the United States and India, neither of which are actually very interested in a free trade agreement with us, but to keep putting more trade barriers between ourselves and our biggest single market, our obviously easiest trading partner, our next door neighbours, one of the wealthiest economic power blocks in the world.
All right. Well, look, it is my duty at the end of these programmes to try to sum up. And what I should be saying at this point, as I usually do, is that I have failed to find common ground. Actually, my failure this week has been even bigger. That actually the three of you rather agree on the important things. That actually there are a series of causes, of which Brexit is one. You may not agree on exactly how big a contribution it's made. That you all agree that we could do something better now. You rather all agree on the issue of migration and economy. I think, Ken, surprisingly to me, you're slightly keener on limitation than I thought you would be. But what you also all agree, common ground, is that Ken Clarke was just a genius Chancellor. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we went back to those days?
Don't debate that any further.
Okay. I want to say thank you to all my three guests.